morning. There's a lot of you. I do a lot of faces I don't recognize. A lot of you have been here before, and other people say, "Oh, they're here today," and that's great and everything. My name, by way of introduction, is Derek. My wife and I moved here about just over 2 months ago. We've been here, so this makes the start of the third month. We came in the first part of February, and we're here now, and we've been here for just a little over 2 months now. My habit is on Sunday mornings to read the scripture. I'm going to bring the message from first. So I'm going to read from John20, the first 18 verses. Early on Sunday morning, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and found that the stone had been rolled away from the entrance. She ran and found Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved. She said, "They have taken the Lord's body out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him." Peter and the other disciple started out for the tomb. They were both running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He stooped and looked in and saw the linen wrappings lying there, but he didn't go in. Then Simon Peter arrived and went inside. He also noticed the linen wrappings lying there, while the cloth that had covered Jesus' head was folded up and lying apart from the other wrappings. Then the disciple who had reached the tomb first also went in, and he saw and believed. For until then they still hadn't understood the scriptures that said Jesus must rise from the dead. Then they went home. Mary was standing outside the tomb crying, and as she wept, she stooped and looked in. She saw 2 white-robed angels, one sitting at the head and the other at the foot of the place where the body of Jesus had been lying. "Dear woman, why are you crying?" the angels asked her. "Because they have taken away my Lord," she replied, "and I don't know where they have put him." She turned to leave and saw someone standing there. It was Jesus, but she didn't recognize him. "Dear woman, why are you crying?" Jesus asked her. "Who are you looking for?" She thought he was the gardener. "Sir," she said, "if you have taken him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will go and get him." "Mary," Jesus said. She turned to him and cried out, "Rabboni," which is Hebrew for teacher. "Don't cling to me," Jesus said, "for I haven't yet ascended to the Father. But go, find my brothers and tell them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene found the disciples and told them, "I have seen the Lord." Then she gave them his message. You know, every Easter we read or we listen to the story of Jesus being raised from the dead, the story of the resurrection. And just like the story of Palm Sunday, which we looked at last week, it's one of the few things that's in all 4 of the Gospels. You know, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all tell of the morning that it was discovered that the tomb was empty. And this makes sense because what happened on that first Easter is probably the defining moment of the Christian faith. You know, we've got Jesus' birth. We've got Jesus revealing the ethics and the core doctrines of the kingdom of God and what we call the Sermon on the Mount. And then there's the events of Good Friday, his betrayal, his arrest, trial, crucifixion, and his burial. But without the resurrection, Jesus was just another good man, a good person who was disposed of when he upset the powers that be. History is full of women and men who would have sparked revolutions, you know, who fought to change the status quo, to bring positive change to their world, but very often they were recognized for the troublemakers that they were, and often in history they have been silenced, imprisoned, exiled, executed, or just assassinated on the sly. Not Jesus, though. He was the good man that you couldn't keep down. John's version of the first Easter Sunday is, like a lot of John's recounting of the life of Christ, a bit different from the other 3, which is in keeping with John's general tone throughout his account, his gospel. John was kind of the black sheep of the 4 people who wrote the gospel accounts, and so I don't think it really should surprise us all that much that his telling of the resurrection is consistent with his overall different kind of take on Jesus' life. John starts his version early on Sunday morning, but he says it was still dark instead of at sunrise like the other three. And he tells us that Mary Magdalene went to Jesus' tomb, but he doesn't say why she went there. Mark says that several women went to the tomb with spices to further prepare Jesus' body for the burial. But John only focuses on Mary Magdalene. According to John, Mary Magdalene goes to the tomb before first light, and she's panicked to see that the stone which had sealed the tomb, and this was no small affair, would have taken like 2 men and a boy to move one of those or something, that it was rolled away. And then he doesn't say that she looked into the tomb, but I think it's logical to assume that she looked and she saw that there was no body laying there on a stone shelf where Jesus had been placed on Friday afternoon. So she runs to find Peter and another unnamed follower of Jesus, another disciple. And she says, someone broke into the tomb and they took Jesus' body. Where could they have taken him? Who could have done this? You know, it's a whole thing. She's obviously quite upset about it, understandably so. So Peter and this other guy, they get up and they run to the tomb to see for themselves. And the odd thing here that this other disciple, when referred to in John's gospel, has traditionally been understood to be John's sneaky way of referring to himself. Remember, this was really before modern novels or modern storytelling, the way we think about it. So it's thought that likely this was John's nod to kind of humility, you know. He wouldn't say, well, Peter and I ran to the tomb, but he would say, Peter and the other disciple started running to the tomb, and the other disciple was me, you know. What's funny about this is that even though John doesn't name himself, he does include the fact that this other disciple outran Peter in the race to the tomb. I don't want to brag on myself, you can imagine John saying, so I'm going to let everyone know that somebody else was there with him that day, and that person left Peter in the dust, you know. Also, he refers to himself as the one whom Jesus loved, which we usually take to mean that he felt that he had an especially close relationship with Jesus. Now, we're not 100% certain that this other disciple was John himself, but you know, that has been the popular theory for centuries. So, track star John, he outruns slowpoke Peter, and they look into the tomb, and he sees that the body is indeed gone, but that the grave clothes there, the linen they would have wrapped the body in Friday afternoon, that those were there on the stone bench still. Peter finally catches up, and he actually goes inside the tomb, and he notices that the wrap that was wound around the head and the face was folded up and lying there apart from the other wrappings. And then John, assuming he actually was this other disciple, he follows Peter into the tomb. When he gets a good look at the wrappings and he sees no body on the bench, John says that person, presumably himself, he believed, it says. Believed what exactly? Well, I think there are basically two choices. One, he believed that Mary was correct, that the body was missing, that it was presumably stolen. Or two, he believed that Jesus had been correct when he told them all that he was going to come back to life on the third day. And I tend to think that the second is more likely, that he was really just kind of starting to entertain this idea that Jesus had been resurrected, but he likely hadn't completely thought through all the implications of this impossible turn of events. And then John tells us they went home. Now, the fact that it kind of looks like they might have just kind of looked at each other with, you know, questioning looks on their faces, shrugged their shoulders and said, well, let's head back home. That seems kind of odd to us, you know. But we got to remember that not only was this all completely new territory for them, we know the story, but for them it was new. And they were grieving. And it's not just they were sad about someone they knew had passed away, as many people are, as we often are, but this was the man that they had spent the last few years following all over Israel. They had left their lives behind. They had followed him all over Israel, and they'd listened to him for hours as he taught. He had confused them and enlightened them by turn in each and every day. This is the man they believed was the Messiah sent from God. He'd been killed by the villains, the baddies, the upholders of the status quo. The bad guys won. And they hadn't really had time to process it yet, or at all. You know, one morning in November of 1992, our phone rang. We were living in Boise at the time, and it was something like 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning. I answered. It was my mom. And you know, somebody calls you at that early in the morning, you know it's not just calling to catch up. But when she said, "We lost your father last night," my first response was, I said, "You're kidding." Like my mom would have kid about something like that, you know, she wouldn't have. As these people were in a situation that they had no framework for understanding. So I don't wonder that, not knowing what to do next, they went home. They went back to where they had been when Mary had barged in and told them that the body was gone. But Mary Magdalene is back in the picture now. And apparently she followed them back to the tomb. And we don't know if they didn't see her when they came out and headed home, or if they did see her, but you know, they're still in shoulder-shrugging mode. They didn't know what to say to her, so they just left her there crying outside the entrance. Maybe they're going back to try to brainstorm, get a search party for the body. But eventually, she stoops down to look into the tomb, and now there are two angels. They're dressed in white. They're sitting on the stone bench where Jesus' body had been. And one of them says, "Miss, why are you crying?" And she says, "Because they took the body away and I don't know where they've taken him." She's upset. Again, you know, she's in a fragile state here emotionally, so she's not necessarily thinking or acting completely irrationally, you know, because I'm thinking, well, you know, did she know that they were angels? You know, John tells us they were angels, but did she know they were angels? If so, why not ask them what's going on? Hey, you don't look like you're from around here. What's the dealio, you know? But if she didn't realize they were angels, then why didn't she ask them what they were doing in Jesus' tomb? Who let you guys in? Did you do something with the body? We just don't know the answers to these questions. John says she turned to leave the tomb or the tomb area, and she saw someone, and I'm thinking maybe out of the corner of her eye, you know, someone standing there outside the doorway. And he too asks her why she's crying. And he says, who are you looking for? And then we are told that this person is Jesus, but she thinks it's the gardener. This would have been probably a groundskeeper for the park. This was a park where tombs were cut into the exposed rock faces. They would excavate in, and then they would find some solid granite or limestone or whatever they had there and cut in and dig these tombs out in there. So she's thinking he's the groundskeeper. And she said, listen, look, if you moved the body that was in here, please tell me where you put him. She's frantic and likely spared this gardener no more than just a quick look, you know, because she wasn't expecting to see the risen Christ. And Jesus says, Mary, you know, and the idea is, Mary, it's me. And she realizes it's Jesus. She steps toward him. She shouts, "Teacher!" And Jesus says, hold on, I'm not able to stay here with you right now, but I want you to go and tell everyone who you've seen me and that I'm on my way into our Father's presence. And it's a brief reunion, but Mary goes back to where the rest of of Jesus' followers, the disciples, are, and she says, I've seen Jesus, and you know what? He is alive. And you know, even though this is my first Sunday here at Willamina Christian Church, I've probably preached over 20 Easter sermons over the years. I was 15 years in Newport, and before that 6 years in Gallup, New Mexico as a pastor. And I don't think I ever got anybody else to preach on Easter Sunday. They said, well, that's what we pay you for, so you got to do it, you know. And I've done Good Friday services, a few of them, and when we lived in Cambodia, and I've done sunrise services. And I've done, at times, the model of resurrection as proof message, you know, more than once, because it's true. If Jesus actually rose from the dead, then, you know, he was who he said he was, and all the things that he taught are true. We can't just discount them. Say he was a good man, but he was confused. Well, he came back from the grave. That takes a lot of questioning out of it, I think. And all it would have taken to snuff out the Christian faith early on was producing the dead body of Jesus after that first Easter. Or if even one of those early disciples, say it was the three that were there, Mary or Peter or John or James or any number of them, if they had, on their deathbed or under pain of torture or something like that, confessed that they had faked the resurrection and stolen the body and buried it in the desert, because that's one theory that's been floated over the years, if anyone would have said that, well, that would have put the lie to the central claim of the followers of Jesus, that he's not dead, that he's back from the dead, he's alive. And earlier this week I read something that pointed out that when Jesus rose from the grave, the prominent god worshipped in the Roman Empire was Jupiter, or maybe the Greek version of the same deity, Zeus. He was the head god of all their pantheon. But 2,000 years later, nobody worships Zeus anymore, or Jupiter, or any of the so-called gods of the Roman cult. And yet now, probably, I looked this up, around 2.5 billion people still worship Jesus because the tomb was empty. However, more than just being the ultimate apologetic trump card, the resurrection is the ultimate sign of hope. When death seems to win, we know that it's not going to have the final word. When cruelty and cynicism and abuse darken our hearts, we know that evil is not ultimately going to win. When lies are all that we hear, we know that truth is going to have its say and it will prevail. When things seem dark, we know that this same Jesus is described by John as the Word that gave life to everything that was created, and His life brought light to everyone. That light shines in the darkness, and the darkness can never extinguish it. When things seem dark, we can know that this was more than just a poetic-sounding wish, because when Mary got to the tomb, Jesus' body was not still lying dead inside. And when I say that because of the resurrection of Christ we can have hope, I'm not just talking about the life after this one, where we'll be reunited with those who've gone before us, and eventually we will come to live in new perfect bodies and a restored, renovated, perfected creation, a new heavens and a new earth. We are waiting for that ultimate fulfillment of that promise that we have in Jesus. But that same hope is changing this world, our lives, the lives of those we know and love for the better. It's doing it right now. As most of you know, my wife and I recently, just last January, moved back to Oregon after spending almost 12 years living and working in Cambodia. It's a little country in Southeast Asia. And I have purposely, from up here especially, tried not to talk about it all the time because, you just say, all that preacher ever does is talk about Cambodia. And I just don't want to bore you with all of my stories about there. And I got to save some of them for later, too. But today I want to talk just a little bit about it because it fits here. It's what came to mind when I talked about the hope of the resurrection. So I hope you'll indulge me just a bit. When we went to Cambodia in 2014, we committed to working with an organization called Agape International Missions, often just shortened to AIM, A-I-M. And it's a Christian anti-trafficking ministry. Specifically, it's an anti-sex trafficking ministry. And up until 2010, I had heard a little bit about sex trafficking, but I didn't really know anything about it. 2010 is when I first visited Cambodia. And we'd like to think that this kind of thing is rare or that it's a relic of the past. But it still happens. And it's as horrible as you might think it would be. The people that founded AIM, they visited Cambodia over 20 years ago. And afterwards, they lived in Northern California. He was an executive pastor. Him and his wife lived there in the Sacramento-ish area. And they learned that they learned about how bad this problem of child sex trafficking was in this country it's a small country, 17, 18 million people. It's wedged between Thailand and Vietnam, and Laos is to the north of it there. in Southeast Asia. Well, they determined to do something about it, and so they put the need before their church. They said, we need to do something about it. Someone needs to step up. And after a year or two of no one stepping up, they said, maybe God's telling us we need to step up. So they moved there to start. Their first thing was an aftercare home for girls who had been trafficked. And the organization has since grown to work in many areas, but that was the very first thing they did, was these girls that they had been rescued out of being trafficked, and they have a place where they can live and be and hopefully find some physical, mental, and emotional healing and spiritual healing. You know, and as bad as the idea of underage girls, often very young children, some of the worst cases were little girls 5, 6 years old, being exploited in this way. As bad as that sounds, it's often worse than what you might think, because many of these girls were actually sold into sexual slavery by their parents. You know, maybe the family is in debt, and I'm not talking to the bank, but to a loan shark, the kind of people that break legs rather than foreclose, you know. And or maybe they've got just more children than they can feed. They're desperately poor. Or dad's a drunk. This often happens. He's not really worth anything. And mom's sick. Maybe she's got AIDS or chronic hepatitis or something like that. There's just all sorts of diseases that we don't have to deal with too much that we're still running rampant in parts of the world. And so they sell one of their daughters, and these girls are often virtually imprisoned in a brothel that bills itself as a karaoke club, a karaoke parlor where businessmen and guys can go and sing karaoke, and they become kind of bar girls, and they're forced to sexually service multiple men each and every night. And believe it or not, some girls voluntarily enter this kind of employment, to use a euphemism it doesn't deserve. Respect for parents in Cambodian culture is often taken to extremes. Parents feel that they gave their best years of their lives to bearing and raising their children, so later on it's the children's turn to take care of them. That's just how they understand things. So let's say a girl's dad is dead, or he's run off. He's got a second family or a girlfriend out in a province or something. Known of plenty of situations like that. And the mom's sick, or maybe she's just run ragged, spent from just working so hard for decades. And maybe this girl, she's got 2 or 3 smaller siblings. You know, some of them babies, some of them grade school age children. And this young woman, she's got no real marketable skills. She's too young to work in a factory. So she's desperate. Then a friend tells her that she can work in a bar or in a club. So she does what she feels like she has to do in order to honor her mother and provide for her family. And it's grim, folks, and there's no way to soft pedal it. Yet, I am happy to report that it's much less of a problem than it was 10, 20 years ago. AIM is not the only Christian organization there. In that over there, they use the shorthand NGO, non-governmental organization, and their word AIM was a Christian NGO. But there's scads of them over there. They're not the only ones doing this kind of work. And although the organization is not perfect, and there have been some missteps along the way, there is just no denying that Christians, either being there and doing and teaching and helping. My wife and I were in support positions with when we went there, but there's no denying that Christians are people that give to these causes over here in the States and in other places. They have made a huge difference in that little country, which is probably 90% Buddhist. Now, personally, I have known several, and I have known of a lot more young adult women who basically came into adulthood in these kinds of situations. They were abandoned by their families. They were raped every day, multiple times a day. They were treated like a cheap commodity. But now they are wives and they are mothers, many of them. Many follow Jesus, and they worshiped in their churches this Easter Sunday just a few hours ago. It's Sunday night in Cambodia right now. And even those who never accepted Jesus, because that was not, they didn't have to. AIM helped them, other organizations helped them, even if they weren't Christians, even if they weren't open to the gospel. It was just out of Christian love. They helped them. But not all of them became Christians. But even those who did not, they know that it's because of the efforts of Christians that they are no longer condemned to what is very likely a very shortened life, and certainly a miserable life. You know, the death and resurrection of Christ it's two sides of the same coin. The death and resurrection of Christ are the proof that this kind of work is worth it. That it's not just delaying the inevitable darkness, but that ultimately there's a light at the end of the proverbial tunnel. Christ's resurrection changed Mary's grief and despair into joy, and it continues to do that yet today. Now, J.R.R. Tolkien is one of my favorite writers. I'm an unrepentant, huge nerd/fan of The Lord of the Rings and all things about it. And I don't care if you don't like the movies or never read the books. I'm not taking incorrect opinions from any of you this morning. But aside from his amazing world building and incredible stories, Tolkien was a follower of Jesus. And he had an especially meaningful way to describe the Christian faith. In a letter to his son that he wrote in 1944, he said, "The birth of Christ is the eucatastrophe of man's history." Now, eucatastrophe, the best I can understand it, is an invented word that he made up, and he put EU in front of catastrophe. EU is a prefix that means good. So he meant this for a sudden, unexpected, joyous turn of events. The birth of Christ, he wrote, is the eucatastrophe of man's history. The resurrection is the eucatastrophe of the story of the incarnation. He said, it's the great thing that changes all things when we talk about Jesus coming as a man. This story begins and ends in joy. There is no tale ever told that men would rather find was true, because it means that everything sad will come untrue. Now, it's kind of stilted, mid-20th century grammar and language, but whenever I think of the implications of the resurrection on that very first Easter morning, I think of the amazing reality that one day everything sad will finally, completely, and forever come untrue. Christ is risen. Thank you. Now, often we frame the Christian faith as, you declare your faith, your belief in Christ, you get baptized, and then you go about to live for Christ. And then, when you die, you'll go to heaven. One day when you die, you'll go to heaven. And that's true. But it's more than that. That's not really the whole story. To follow Christ is to join in this ongoing project of making everything sad come untrue. And we just want to invite you, if you're, maybe you've made an initial commitment, but you've let that go. Or maybe you need to make an initial commitment. You need to come and you need to get baptized today. I don't do it, but there is water in that baptistry every Sunday. If that is something you want to do today, you need to do today. When I got hired, Joel was very, very adamant to say, we got to have an invitation, because someone might come forward, they don't know they're going to that day, because sometimes that does happen. I think that was his story on that. But if you need to do that, you're invited to do that. And you can come and start this project. Sin entered the world in a garden, and we've been paying the price for that ever since. But here in another garden, Mary saw the gardener, and she was more right than she knew, wasn't she? He started that project of rebuilding the garden that he meant his creation to be. And one day it will be completely restored to that. Maybe you want to get in on that. You need to get in on it. You want to make your life count for something to help making everything sad come untrue. We're going to sing a song. The music team's going to come up and lead it in just a bit. And as we do that, if you need to, you want to, maybe you just need to rededicate your life, you need prayer or something like that, come on up to the front. I'll be standing down here. Would you stand with me?